going to talk about investigative interviewing, and that's a huge topic in itself, but to not bring in the history would be impossible when we talk about investigative interviewing.
Absolutely.
So the historical, should we say, perspective. But before we get into that, the first time you and I, Ivar, met, that was back in 1990.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
At the police academy in Oslo.
Yeah.
We happened to end up in the same class.
Yeah, we did.
Class P.
Their story goes way back. Join us as we explore the journey of the founding fathers of investigative interviewing in Norway, Dr. Ivar Fahsing and Dr. Asbjørn Rachlew. Together, they have worked tirelessly to change the mindsets of law enforcement, both in Norway and globally. Listen to how it all started, right here on the first episode of Beyond a Reasonable Doubt, with me, Børge Hansen, CEO of David Horn.
And then we got this robbery case with the most famous robbery, should we say, gang in Norway. They were called Tveitagjengen, the Tveita gang or whatever, yeah. And we got that case, you and I.
Yeah, it was a break-in. It was not a robbery.
No, it was a shock break.
Yes, a shock break they made. But no, it wasn't, was it, Asbjørn? Because it was you're talking about the David Andersen break.
Yeah.
But wasn't that done concealment? Didn't they park a car outside and went in it? It looked like a car that was collecting carpets from the area entrance area, and they hid behind that car and broke in. So it was the opposite of a shock break in that way, that people were just standing outside with their backs towards the windows of this very shop while it was looted. So, but it's interesting how memory works.
Yeah. Because I remember
a shock break, because most of the other cases they did have, they went in quite brutally, and they never did robberies, I think, but they did break-ins in a spectacular way. But I think this case specifically was done in a very concealed way, and no one actually understood it had happened until people who actually worked there came there a couple of hours later in the morning. So that was part of our investigative problem, wasn't it? That no one actually saw it. And they had but what they did, Paul Enger, he was the mastermind, and he had been planning this very thoroughly. So he had gone inside there and seen where does the alarm go off, where does it not go off. So he had a safe route through the whole shop, so how you could kind of go like a maze, steal these things, where are the most valuable things, what should you get, and then get out again. And himself, he was another when he didn't do it, because he was the planner, so he got other people to do it, so he didn't immediately connect to the crime. And that led us to the bigger project when the famous painting Scream was stolen. That had exactly the same pattern. Yeah. And that was a big, and then we were really in with the big guys at the CID, both of us. Yeah. And that was, I think, seen already then as a quite important recognition for both of us. We felt proud. Yeah. Absolutely. Because like you said, becoming a detective at that level in the beginning of the 90s was actually a huge step. We got to wear suits. There was no messing around. There was no jeans at that time at the CID. We got a higher salary, even got higher rank. We became sergeants overnight. Politibetjent. We went from constables to sergeant in one move, relatively quickly at least. Yeah. So it was also a promotion.
Absolutely. And that brought us from the downtown Centrum precinct to the headquarters.
Where all the big guns were, and people you just heard of, and legends. People you saw on the media on a weekly basis. Now all of a sudden we were part of that. And it was an aura of, this is not a place for everybody. You had that feeling that you are
privileged or
handpicked.
Yeah, handpicked. Yeah. Yeah, no, we can talk about the old days, and there are so many stories, but we are here to talk about investigative interviewing, the most important part of our job as detectives, how to interview witnesses, victims, and suspects, of course.
It's interesting to take that back to the 90s, because at that time we were not head of the investigations. We were, you could say, rising stars in a way, young and you have potential, but where you to prove your potential was very often in the interviews, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And there were, at that time, it's no secret that if it was difficult, we needed a confession.
Yeah.
And that's where you were really good. You would go to man if you had cases that you had less evidence and you needed to push and, help them, to put it that way, to make that confession.
Yeah.
And wasn't it?
Absolutely. When I travel around the world now, today, 30 years later, we'll come back to that, but we do a lot of training and lectures and talks around the world with the United Nations and the Council of Europe, etc. And I always start my lecture with this very opening. Like most detectives around the world, I was taught to believe that once we had a suspect, it was my job to get him to confess.
Absolutely.
Some detectives took that angle, should we say, harder than others. But I was definitely into that view of the world, and I was applauded.
It gave a lot of status if you could deliver that.
Oh yeah.
Of course, it was such a relief, because then you can slowly move on to the next case. But as you probably remember, I was not of the same opinion.
No.
I could argue with people in interviews and say that it doesn't make sense what you're saying, but I was not in the same way like you.
No.
Focused on necessarily a confession. I remember it was specifically one case where this came to really surfaced very strongly, and it was an attempted murder, wasn't it, of the Outlaws president?
Yeah, that's right. So we're back in mid-90s.
The gang war?
Yeah, between
outside biker.
The biker war in Oslo between Hells Angels and Bandidos, but there were other gangs as well. Yeah, as you said, Outlaws, etc. And they were shooting at each other and killing each other. There were even bombs in Norway at the time. And one of the cases, certainly, was a shooting, and we finally, we had a suspect, and we had evidence against him that he was probably the shooter. But the big question was, I would presume, because we wanted the gang leaders, we wanted, the heads of Hells Angels or whatever. And I remember, and we were on the case, and I remember, at the time we didn't have any recordings, so we couldn't follow the interviews or the interrogations. No. But I read the reports, and you were interviewing the suspect, and in my opinion, you were not getting anywhere. In my world at the time, that was, you did not get him to confess who gave him the weapons and who ordered the killings, etc. So I went to our senior investigating officer,
Anne Karin,
and I said, okay, listen, Anne Karin, Ivar has been interviewing this guy now for weeks, and we're not getting any results. And I think that we should be tougher on him. I think, and she looked at me and, you want to give it a go? And I said, yeah, I'm ready. And you were involved in the discussion, and you said, okay, if you want to try that, but I feel that, you said, I feel I communicate well with him.
At least we're talking well.
Yeah.
I don't know if everything he says is true,
no,
but he wanted to talk to me.
You were gathering information, but to me at the time,
we didn't move ground quickly enough.
Yeah.
No, exactly.
And it was decided then that I would take over the interview of the suspect. And I think that interview lasted for 5 minutes or something, because I came in there and really, from the top, and came down on him and nothing physical or anything. I mean, we never took part in any of that in Norway. We were lucky in that way that our colleagues before us has abandoned all kinds of physical, shall we say, techniques. There were no physical torture, but I was certainly coming down on him, and then he just, I think he just stood up and said, I don't want to
take me back to the cell.
Yeah. And that was it. No more information for us.
Rikken was his name.
Right.
You remember? Jan Ivar. But he said it was an act of self-defense. So you remember, he was also shot in the foot. Because I remember the first interviews with him I had to take at the hospital. And how could I know, without any evidence, that this was actually an attempted murder? I couldn't know that. He said, I went there. Yes, I was armed because I was kind of a gang war going on, and I was kind of visiting enemy turf. But I went there with different intentions. And you thought, I think all of us thought that was kind of vague. And it didn't entirely match the stories of the people who this ended up in shoot. But we didn't really know who started the shooting and what was the reason for it. So there was no clear motive, like in other cases, like we had, where you could see A started B and B started C, and it was much clear in sequence of things. I was lacking that here, so I didn't really know, and I just tried to find out. So for me, that was my job to what did happen then. And, the victim could be telling the truth, but so could the suspect.
Absolutely.
So I get that. But at the same time, Asbjørn, we were, we were deeply we did a lot of interviews in a lot of high profile cases.
I wanted to become, because that task force was, it was
very potent.
Yes, these were the most famous detectives, at least in Oslo. These were the really most. They were given the task to travel around, live at the hotels, and solve all these cases. High profile cases, a lot of media, etc. And they brought me along as a, I would say, as a recruit, and I was even allowed to sit in and learn from the detective at the time, who was regarded as the best interviewer in Norway, our dear colleague and friend, Stian L.
Yeah, that's true. He was definitely someone who we admired.
Yeah. And
he had this really special gift of creating trust and confessions. And you wanted to learn from the best.
Yeah.
And you had an opportunity there.
Yeah, I did. And
shortly after, he started at Kripos.
That's right. His reputation brought him then to the National Homicide Squad in Norway. So he left Oslo Police District, and that became somehow his destiny, because in 1995, Birgitte Tengs was murdered on the west coast of Norway. This was a high-profile case in Norway. When a young girl is murdered just outside her home, a heavy pressure is put on the police. We had to solve that one. I was not involved in investigation because I worked in Oslo, but clearly the pressure was on, but it was a difficult case. No immediate evidence, no witnesses, and the case remained unsolved for almost 2 years.
It did.
Yeah. And can you imagine?
And they used profiling. They had some kind of idea. I remember it was a lot of things that experimented that in that case, and they were building up a pressure. And I think without the evidence, they started to profile that it could be this cousin of Birgitte. That could be because he was seen as goofy, and there were some incidents with girls in the school, and he was seen having some kind of, mildly deviant sexual behavior. They thought about it as, and so we actually brought in a profiler from Stockholm. And they did something that is really, really interesting, and we've seen elsewhere later that not only did he make the profile, but he also made a conclusion that now the guy they had arrested probably was the guilty person. And I think that's something that I think hasn't been discussed in detail. Why did Stian Elle feel that he could go so far in pressuring this young boy?
Yeah.
And I think that the support, the psychological support he, as an interviewer, got from the Swedish psychiatrist Ulf Åsgaard was probably very important.
I happen to know 20 years later how important that was, because 20 years after, but we have to tell the listener that when Stian, or at least one of our idols, at least one of my idols as a detective interviewer, when he finally got the cousin to confess after interrogations after hours after hours, days after days, weeks after weeks. Keep in mind the cousin was in full isolation. And after at least 180 hours, the cousin confessed. But he retracted his confession very quickly. He said, I never had any memory of it. But he had signed the police statement.
Yeah.
Of course, back in those days, we didn't use recordings.
No.
But he had signed this odd statement confessing. And he was convicted in the first trial.
And he didn't, in all fairness, if I've understood it correctly, he didn't, as I've heard it, deny outright. He said, if you said I did it, the fact is that if that is the case, I can't remember I've done it.
Yeah.
Is that just a myth?
No, well, the thing is that he said that in the beginning, he said, I had nothing to do with it. But then, and this idea, I think, came from the psychiatrist, the Swedish psychiatrist, who, and you're quite right, he had made a profile and he said it fits exactly on the cousin. And then the Norwegian police were advised then to conduct the interrogations, then take him back to the cell in isolation and tell him, okay, if we want you now to do homework, we want you now to write a script of how you think Birgitte was killed.
Yeah.
But after weeks and hours and days and weeks, this story, I've read it. It's like a movie about, eventually these two stories kind of merged.
Yeah, they did, miraculously.
Yeah.
And Stian and Krippos at that time, they had a method where they kind of claimed that the interviewer of the suspect didn't know the details from the case, from the crime scene. I think he used a word. There was a Chinese wall between me and the evidence. Mm-hmm. So I couldn't have transferred those words in his mouth.
Yeah. And we know today that not only was that false information from the police, could be a lie as well, but what we do know from research on false confessions, later on, Brandon Garrett in the United States, he has looked into false confessions in the United States, 40 of them in the first study. And what's so interesting about Brandon Garrett's studies is that he have documented that in these 40 cases of proven false confessions, the judge convicted the innocent based on the false confession due to the fact that the confession contained details that only the perpetrator could have known. And Brandon Garrett did one more thing. He managed to document that the police or the prosecution service in 38 of those 40 cases had testified under oath that those details did not come from them. But Brandon Garrett's studies shows, like my studies of the cousin's confessions, that the details came from the police through leading questions, among other things.
It's really interesting, Asbjørn, because when you think about that, we're in 2024.
Yeah.
Think about how interesting it would have had to have those interviews on tape.
Oh, man.
If we really had, we probably wouldn't have been sitting here discussing these things, because we would have known. And I think we can probably go even further, because I think although the Norwegian police at that time didn't have training, and as you said, we were really proud of Stianelle when he got this confession, and both you and me called him or texted him. It was new era, brand new mobile phones and all that. But so we were kind of proud. We thought that was good police work.
Yeah.
But despite that, it wasn't kind of accepted. We knew deep down there that these kind of pressures, and especially what they did, told him to write a story that he already had said he didn't do it. So it was against the legislation. And I would at least think that if that was on tape, probably the police would have constrained themselves.
Absolutely.
One thing is we can document exactly what was said.
I mean,
probably there would be an effect that they would be a little bit more afraid of going that far in their manipulation, in their leading questions, and it would become evident then that they had transferred the evidence to the suspect, and their leading questions and the pressures and the expectations about. But I remember we said that at one time to the legendary defense lawyer Tor Erling Staff, because when we started the first training in Norway and we started recording, he said, "Well, I hear what you're saying. I'm kind of happy, but I'm not relieved," he said, "because what will happen is that you will just move the pressure outside of the interviewing room. So you will do it anyway." He didn't trust us at all.
No, he didn't trust us, and I would say rightly so. Rightly so. No, you're absolutely right. Interrogators like myself would, I could not have gone as far in my pressures and in my manipulation and etc. if there were recordings of the whole thing. But that's undoubtedly, because if the defense lawyers got hold of those tapes, and they would, a recording is part of the case files, and then had brought it to the courts would not have accepted it as evidence. So we undoubtedly we would have saved a lot of errors of justice, a lot of wrongful convictions, if we had introduced recording of police interviewing. But it has to be mandatory recording.
Yeah. Yes,
it can't be. It can't be like, the police decide which interview to record, and no, it has to be mandatory, recorded. That's number one, and number two is that the entire interview has to be recorded.
Absolutely.
And this was the defense lawyers, the famous defense lawyers, should we say, objection, he was afraid that we would conduct informal talks down in the cell or in the staircase up to the interview room, etc. Because he didn't trust us.
No.
So when we introduced recordings in, should we say,
2000, 1990.
Yeah. We made sure that we did not conduct any informal talks with the suspects prior to the interview.
Absolutely.
And in fact, we brought it into our methodology so that...
To ask them.
Yeah. Have you and I met before? Or
exactly.
Yeah. I met you downstairs. You picked me up. Okay. What did we talk about? No, we talked about the football game, Liverpool or whatever. And did we talk about anything else? No. Okay. And then we introduced, and this is my third point related to how electronic recorded interviews must be. Number one, the entire interview. Number two, there must be no informal talks outside the formal interview. And number three, the fundamental safeguards that all suspects have or should, they must be explained on tape.
Absolutely.
It is a highly important part of the interview. We call it the formal part.
Yep. How was you empowered? How did we actually inform you about why you are here, your rights?
Yeah.
That's what makes it an interview, isn't it? And produce this evidence. Without that, this is just a conversation.
Yeah.
But I was thinking when we were saying about documentation, because yes, one, two, the legal side of it. But one big part here is then police officers do this despite the fact that they know it's outright or illegal, or at least bending the rules. And that's what I really think is interesting, Asbjørn. When we did that in the 90s, we know that we were bending the rules to get results. Very often today, when we travel around, like, you and me, we have the benefit and a fantastic opportunity to go and share our experiences from China in East to Brazil. You just came back from Suriname in South America.
Yeah.
Just before Christmas, I was in Antigua, and what we see is that when we get into heated discussions about how to do it, they actually know that they're breaching fundamental international conventions on human rights, and particularly the Civil and Political Rights Article 14, where it's explicitly said that you should know why you're here. You should have legal counsel, a possibility to talk to a lawyer.
Absolutely.
And you have the right to silence, and you have the right not to incriminate yourself. And all detectives know that. When we, in heated discussion, remind them of this convention that is from 1966, then all of a sudden the discussion changes. Well, so we're going to play by the rules. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yes. So that's interesting, that an important part of what we today call investigative interviewing is actually following the rules.
Yeah.
And I think it's under-communicated that the rules has been there all along.
The presumption of innocence, the right to silence.
It's very long-standing principles that goes back to the early Roman empires, and we're still reproducing the same mistakes of a society that needs answers in difficult cases, and the police and the prosecutions as agents of that pressure, where we direct that pressure to that suspect because now we need someone to convict. And in that, I think you probably write about it a lot in your PhD thesis. It's what we can call a noble cause corruption.
Yeah.
It was seen as a noble cause corruption.
Yes.
Because you thought that you actually convicted the right guy.
Yes.
Wasn't that the logic?
Yes. I mean, I've been an expert witness before the Norwegian courts quite a few times in these very difficult cases. You've been in a couple of them yourself. And I've not come across one case in which my colleagues or the police made sure that an innocent man were convicted. They believed they had the right man. They convinced themselves. I mean, if you look back to the old techniques that were written in 1987 in Norway, this was the first article written on police interviewing in 1987 by two teachers, highly renowned detectives and leaders within the Norwegian police. And they actually wrote that when you have a suspect in front of you, you have to convince yourself that he is the guilty one. You must never lose that absolutely inner confidence that he is the perpetrator. Exactly. That's how we were taught to motivate ourselves. It was confession driven.
It was seen as weakness to think that maybe he's innocent.
Yeah,
that's not your job.
No.
Leave that to himself or the defense lawyer or someone else, but it's not our job. You're not focused enough.
And as you said, this was, and of course still is, and hopefully forever will remain, it's not the way to operationalize the presumption of innocence. But it was not before this kind of attitude or culture, confession culture. They called it in the UK the cuff culture. It was not before it had created wrongful convictions after wrongful convictions in the United Kingdom, in which the government, I would presume in England, and in the UK, said that enough is enough, and ordered mandatory recordings of all interviews of suspects back in 1984.
Yeah, the law came in 84, and then they needed a couple of years to actually get it done. So I think 86 was when it actually commenced doing the interview recordings.
Right.
And then
interesting things started to happen.
Like we just say, what would have happened if we've had this on tape? All of a sudden, they did, didn't they?
They did. And this allowed also researchers to listen to and to give advice and start developing methodology and alternative. Because if you take away a tool from a practitioner, in our case, that tool was manipulation. In many countries, that tool is still torture.
Outright.
Physical torture.
Yes.
Now, if you take away a tool from a practitioner, you have to provide him or her with an alternative. An alternative they find applicable, that they can use to solve crime.
Yeah.
And that's the paradigm shift. Started in the UK back in the early 1990s.
You had the legendary report. We have to say it was actually ordered by the Home Office.
Yeah.
It was John Baldwin who got the exclusive permission to actually look into 400 audio-taped interviews where he didn't slaughter it, but he said there is absolutely no sign of any skill here.
No.
And they some of them, the people who are regarded the best, are probably the most dangerous.
Yes.
And said they're playing with the fire.
Yeah.
But what these people need is not advanced psychology. He said they need basic social and communication skills.
Yeah.
I think it's almost word by word what he said. It's such an interesting testimony about, you should think that police officers that had as a profession to talk to people
Absolutely. And that started what we today know as investigative interviewing, research-based interviewing techniques, founded in both human rights, but also in social science, about communication skills, about how human memory works, how all this. But it also in the UK, it needed agents of change from within the police to really, should we say, get things going and change the culture.
You couldn't kind of accuse the police from the outside. Of course, defense lawyers did, but that was more or less seen as normal.
Yeah.
But at that time, you had Baldwin's report 1992, but the same year, or was it the year after, Eric Shepherd was one of the guys also that really inspired you and me when we started to read texts. When we later understood there are actually texts and literature and research on this.
Yes,
I think that's probably one of the texts that was most interesting, because he called it ethical interviewing.
Yes,
he brought in a very different dimension, ethical, and he was the one who said there is a cuff culture, meaning that you are taking with you the order and control and the use of force that the police are allowed to use, if necessary, in the streets. But when you're a detective, that's no longer your job. You are here purely to investigate with an open mind, and you shouldn't use the same kind of control measures that you think you're entitled to just because you're a cop. And I think they've just messed it up. And I think also Eric was the one who, at least as far as I can see in the literature, brought in general communication skills. How should this be done then?
Yes.
What are the basics of interpersonal communication, and kind of opening up those doors that we're still, led into the corridors that we're still exploring.
Absolutely. He wrote the article "Ethical Interviewing." It was a powerful article. It was highly critical towards the police, but it was so it was so powerful that when I came back from my studies in the UK, and then were given the task to develop and bring this knowledge from the UK about the research and investigative interviewing, I told my bosses, my colleagues here in Norway, we need to read something. We can't only have a course. We have to have some literature, but there was nothing in Norwegian. But I then asked if I could get actually a month or so off duty to translate Eric Shepherd's Ethical Interviewing, because I thought that was the most important, should we say, text in order to change the mindset. Because that's what we're talking about. We needed to change our mindset.
The change of the mindset, and what is doing this in a legal, scientifically based way, what is it really? And then I remember also you brought another document, and that was the trainer's manual from Merseyside Police.
Yes.
How to train investigative interviewing from a trainer's perspective, written by Günther Kunken,
the German,
and Rachlew.
That's right.
So then that was a very early manual. I think it was already from 1995
or 94, I think, in Merseyside Police.
So then, and it's interesting to think about it now. Ray, of course, he's an absolute legend in this game, and we can both say we are lucky enough to regard him as a dear friend.
Yes, absolutely. Certainly one of the pioneers, and we already mentioned Eric Shepherd, and then of course you had Tom Williamson, another agents of change from within the police.
Tom Williamson was on a high level. He was a high-ranking officer already early on. He went all the way to commander, and did training, did academic studies just like we did, and realized the need for change. And he was probably brave enough to verbalize it.
Yeah.
And I remember when you and me were starting to criticize, or at least verbalize the need for change, you at Oslo, me at Kripos, just knowing that a guy like Tom Williamson had just done that a couple of years back, 10 years back. He went exactly the same path. It made us it was so inspirational.
Absolutely.
And motivational.
Yeah.
And we felt a little bit more safe.
It gave us confidence. It gave us confidence when the UK had, changed its entire police force and introduced mandatory recording of all suspects' interviews. It gave us confidence that was the right way forward. Yeah.
Recording. Train all detectives, or actually all police officers were trained in exactly the same fundamental methods. Not too advanced, but not enough to take you a long way. It's fundamental skills that you have to practice and practice again. And it's not advanced psychology. For the majority of officers need those practical skills. And I remember in our career, Asbjørn, I remember one of the most rewarding moments was in 2006 when we were actually invited to the first World Conference on Interviewing in Europe, where we were invited to speak.
Yeah,
that was a big moment, and Tom Williamson was the organizer.
Yeah, he was.
And meeting him for you and me was a big thing.
Yeah.
At least it was for me.
Of course, and for some reason, probably the paper that we had handed in describing the talk we were going to hold, we were actually put on the main stage, the huge auditorium at the university.
Yes.
I was so nervous, and
in English, we both had done our masters in England at that time, but still giving a lecture to such an audience. And on top of that, after the lecture, he asked us to do a book chapter in his coming book.
Tom Williamson came almost running towards us after the presentation that we had given, and said, "You guys have to take part of the book," and we did, and today that paradigm shift is now, thanks to the cooperation, I would definitely say, between the Norwegian police and the Norwegian Center for Human Rights. Because at a certain point in our career, we got engaged with the Norwegian Center for Human Rights, because they had been traveling around the world telling the police what not to do. Don't do this, don't do that. If you do that, you will be punished, etc.
Follow the convention.
Yeah, but I think one of their researchers listened to our lectures here in Norway, and then they realized that this is the alternative. This is how to actually do it. And that's 15 years ago, and we haven't been home since. And the testimony that we can bring from Norway, that this is the way forward. Because if you talk to Norwegian police officers today, police officers that had experience before investigative interviewing and electronic recording of the entire interview, and after the introduction of it, and ask them today, what do you think? Because there were colleagues that were skeptical, of course, not only to the new methodology, but certainly also to recording. Why should we record it? Can't we trust the police anymore, etc., etc. But when you
it was seen as the end of interviewing.
Yeah, it was. It was, by some, definitely, by many. But when you ask police officers today, none of them, and I feel quite confident, none of them wants to go back to the old system without recording. Or you remember how it was to stand in the big trials in the courts as one of the main witnesses for the prosecution, and having nothing but a written paper to back up your argument. Today, testifying in court with electronic recording of the entire session is a different world.
It is.
And of course, you have to be professional.
it's a daylight test that we.
It is.
Does just the way you do your job, and it makes you probably less reluctant to actually prepare what you're doing, plan it, do it in as a good way as you actually can, because you know that one day some people might actually look into this.
Another thing is that people were colleagues, police officers were skeptical. Those who were against interviewing, they said that no, as you said, it was seen as the end of interviewing. And one of the arguments or beliefs was that, the suspect is never going to talk to us now. We're never going to get any confessions now, and the microphones and the cameras, etc. They will hamper the communication. But it doesn't.
Probably even doesn't. Probably what we faced, Asbjørn, 4 or 5 years after we started doing this, or probably even quicker. The prosecutors came to us, didn't they? Because they said, hey guys, you're getting too much information. So they kind of had to stop the wave of information hitting them. And rightly so, because we were documenting, and we all of a sudden we understood how effective this tool is, and how much information is actually there, and how much information we have stopped from the closed question, the confession focus, and typing as you go. But I think if you're supposed to kind of also think, why did Tom Williamson really want us to do that lecture? And why did he want us to do that book chapter? And there was also something that we brought along that the peace model didn't have. And it was a different way of how to deal with evidence evaluations. Because we were actually evaluating evidence in a very different way than our colleagues and ourselves indeed have done in the past. So instead of just looking for things that confirmed your guilt, we were now actively, and that's the model we picked up in Sweden. From Christian Diesens, where we've later found out that stems from actually a professor in law who's seen to how does the Supreme Court in Sweden actually argue when they say that this guy should be acquitted or not. So what does it mean, the expression beyond reasonable doubt? And he said, he says, it means that then you have to test whether there are any other stories or hypotheses that can explain the same evidence. And if it isn't, and if you now can rule them out, then you might convict. But if there are any other stories or ideas around how this evidence might have arisen, then there is doubt, and the defendant should be acquitted.
Absolutely.
So that's the paradigm shift, I think, also that we were lucky enough to bring to England, at least at that time. That over time, and like you and me, Asbjørn, now we're not just dealing with interviews anymore. It's more about how to deal with A, how to think like a detective, B, how to evaluate evidence. But so that's it. The journey we've been lucky enough to not only be passengers only, we've been in the front seat, rightly so, with a lot of other very, very good colleagues from both Oslo and Kripos and different places in the Norwegian police. We probably have changed much more than just the interview style.
Absolutely. We changed the mindset of the detectives, and of course later on I did my PhD in areas of justice and identifying what was the underlying cause in all these areas of justice. These wrongful convictions. It took me 2-3 years into the reading of the literature. Then I realized it was the cognitive biases. It was tunnel vision. It was confirmation bias. But I was finished with my PhD, so I had to. That was my conclusion. And then you started your PhD and started right there and did your PhD on decision making. But it started with interviewing. Going from confession orientated, which is confirmative, which is very dangerous. I mean, and that's you with a PhD in decision making. What kind of what does that do to your methodology and your thinking and evaluation of evidence if your mindset is to confirm your hypothesis?
And it's interesting, though, that I think we'll probably put down the landing gear now for this conversation, because we're arriving at least for the first milestone there. We can say that's why it's called investigative interviewing.
Exactly.
Your job is to investigate, find new information. You can actually leave it to someone else to conclude. It's never been your job as a police officer, and never will be.
So research, human rights go hand in hand, and then you have technology, as we've also mentioned, and what an exciting future we're headed towards. I mean, one thing is the electronic recording of the entire session and do it safe, etc. It should be mandatory all over the world, and I'm quite sure it will at a certain point. But then you have speech to text and summaries, accurate summaries. No, it's an exciting, but
hopefully what we've taken in was that if you, as you said, you found towards the end of your PhD that the common mistake here is as they we're simplifying it. We're just taking in one solution. It's a cognitive, but it's caused by a cognitive function that just boils down. What can I cope with? And now what we're recommending is to cope with complexity. We take in all the possible explanation, and we're supposed to check that against all possible evidence. So, of course, that level of complexity requires something more than the human brain then. We do need tools that can, as you said, gather exactly all the information, document it, but also do cross-checking for us. Maybe come up with some links. Listen, Asbjørn, in that case over there was someone with the same car, or they had a similar modus operandi. They did it the same way at crime. Is that something you should track? Give you the leads that helps you handling this complexity, and probably also breaking it down so that you can chunk it into evidence topics, and so I think where we are now, we know what to do, but we need technological help for how to do it better. Where our brains can't cope with it, we need a tool not to make conclusions for us, but to help us make better decisions.
Yes, absolutely. We just started. The direction is pointed towards scientific research and technological develelopment, and so we just started. We're just at the beginning. Look at. Sometimes we talk about medicine. I mean, it's not that long ago. It was dangerous to be at a hospital, because the poor doctors didn't have methodology or equipment or knowledge, and that's where the diseases was, And look at today, how have they advanced? Through science, through and of course methodology.
Interpretation of evidence.
And, of course, electronic devices that can help you do your job and document and do it right. And
knowledge sharing.
Knowledge sharing, not to mention.
One of the articles we've written, if the police knew what the police know, we'd have solved almost all the cases.
Yeah.